So Abu Dhabi Finance Week, about 15,000 people come.
Good grief.
And there's days allocated to private equity, to family offices, to crypto, to infrastructure, renewables. And part of it is also a day allocated to sort of, if you like, the legal profession and those associated with it. And it's called Resolve. And they wanted to sort of challenge the paradigms. And that sort of what came to mind there was in the context of having seen lots of disputes through my career, and a lot of it in insolvency, was to sort of look at the impact of the social licence as companies and governments and stakeholders face up to insolvencies, and how they react and should react, and how they should try and work together to try and potentially get a better outcome than sometimes might be the case if it's just left to languish and then head into some form of formal administration.
Has it always been the case as restructuring people that we always think we're facing headwinds, right? We're always building a narrative around that, oh, these are tough times, these are uncertain times. I don't know how many presentations I've delivered where I've said that over the years. Although, do you think there's something a bit unique about where we are now?
We're facing a lot of disruption. AI is going to disrupt things. Existing company business models are going to get disrupted significantly, I suspect, with AI. So, yes, there's going to be, I think, a lot more happening in that space. And I think society's expectations have shifted. They're certainly shifted from what we had, 25 years ago.
But is there now a contract between companies and the public? So the role of Qantas on The Voice, the role of Woolies in Australia Day, the role of the Institute of Company Directors and the ASX in relation to governance, the role of KPMG in relation to just about everything.
I think where it's become far more divided has been on, what might be in the community seen as being itself divisive issues, and a board taking what some would say a political issue, backing one side or the other, backing one side or perhaps not saying anything on the other side. And I think that's, the rules and the thought and the guidance on that, I think have still got to play out. But, I think there's some areas where it's incontrovertible. Yes, they've got a role to play.
Yes. Let's talk then about the expectation of the public for the delivery of a social licence in the restructuring sector. So does the social licence in a struggling company extend the same way? Do you think a struggling company should be looking beyond its stakeholders in the order of priority into the public interest, and where do we draw that line, do you think?
At a practical level, it may be difficult to define in the abstract, but at a practical level, it won't take that long to understand, a Joe Hayes talking to a company and an environment. Who are the key stakeholders? Who do we have to get into the room? And for then, what sort of buy-in do we expect from them? And what if and then other issues arise, which is what if they don't want to participate?
The company can't be expected to turn up in its baseball cap and bat and sort that out. They're just and so where do you find the leadership? Government won't want to lead because they'll be writing the check, and the company can't lead, and the banks can't lead, and
so it was interesting. I mean, as a lawyer, sometimes we all go into rooms thinking we know the solution, and but it was put to me by a very large global company, how difficult it is in that context to actually convene the meeting, to be at the head of the table, so to speak, wearing the baseball cap, the peak cap of the company that they represent, and talk to everyone there saying, thank you all very much for turning up here. It's great, and we're all here together to solve this. And everyone just looks at you with the peak cap and just says, well, we know why you're here.
Yeah, that's right. I agree with you. And let's talk about court processes, because like you, I say, the longer we can maintain principle to principle discussion here, the better off we are. So the courts have a place. I mean, where do you see the courts in resolving disputes?
The more you continue on this, in this temporal sense, from I've got an issue with, we've got an issue in the family, we've got an issue in the joint venture, we've got an issue with our licensee of the pharmaceutical distribution, whatever it's going to be, products, and you head to court, the commercial outcomes just diminish.
Yes.
And if you talk to the business people, and lawyers so many lawyers, they just get caught up in the process. The business people, by and large, hate it. Yeah. They hate it. It's uncertain, it's expensive, and it's time consuming. I mean, most CEOs want to be out there making money for their shareholders and doing, going back to Larry Fink and fulfilling those objectives. They don't want to be caught up in litigation.
You need mediations to be taken seriously, though, in that context, don't you?
Yeah.
And I think we do see mediation sometimes if the principals and the lawyers have lost touch with what they're doing, they see mediation as a step to begin the litigation. So let's just touch on that for me.
One of the questions in large organisations is who's actually funding this? I mean, it's coming from X company, but it's coming out of someone's P&L.
Yeah.
And it's coming out of a business's P&L, and that's going to have an impact on that business. It's going to have an impact on bonuses, KPIs, etc. So just be mindful of that, and before you actually go in. So that's part of the role of the mediator, I see, to sort of explore behind the scenes whether the right people are there.
Yeah. Whereas the mediations we see, someone has scheduled 2 days, and off we go. Well, that's.
The North American and European experience, I think, is, and mine, is that, the idea that you'll turn up next Wednesday week and you and I will have,
a roadmap for settlement.
And there'll be, 5, 10 or more parties in a room and we'll settle it in 2 days is just completely fanciful.
Yeah. I mean, if we look at Safe Harbour as a change in the restructuring landscape 7 years in, I think finally people are beginning to talk about that as working, right, and are happy to say, well, yes, we've been through that kind of process. So it does take time, I think, and a change in psychology. So something more than the individuals who are involved.
Yeah. And I think our society's matured a lot too. I mean, the people recognise that there are roles to play for NGOs and the union movement, and it's not just an us and them approach. We have a country where we have to focus on productivity. We have to focus on innovation, and
we do have fully formed institutions who are good at that.
Yeah. So bearing in mind if those things, if we have those as goals and we think they're achievable, it's like governance. APRA puts out its report yesterday on governance. There's unless you've got a framework sometimes. It's like building a building and not knowing exactly where the hydraulics are or the electrical wiring system, etc. So you've got to have something. So having some guiding principles or whatever, but there might have to be some sorts of sanctions if you don't do that. But I certainly wouldn't want to be sitting here and being prescriptive, saying there's fines and penalties. Yeah. I'm not suggesting that. I think this is a more nuanced approach. Yeah. And it needs it needs some discussion and thought with financiers and others, AICD, to work through the mechanics of how this would work effectively. But if our goal is clear, then it seems to me it can be achieved.
Well, it sounds like a wonderful call out, I think, to the industry or to society to say, well, there's things that can be done here and we just need to find the forums to make them happen.
Yeah.
Final thoughts, Tim?
I think final thoughts. Look, I've spent my life in courts. You reach an age like I do where you sit back and you think there are better ways to resolve matters in the commercial world. And I think we need to be just a bit smarter and a bit more nimble and address issues earlier on. And, when I started, I did the first probably major mediation in Australia with Sir Lawrence Street. And that was in Spedley, 1992.
I was involved.
Spedley, I think, spawned something like 55 pieces of litigation were involved in the Supreme Court. And Lawrence used to just say, he came along and he said, we should try and settle matters. And there was incredible cynicism. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, fancy trying to settle matters.
Yes.
I mean, using a mediator? I mean, it was absurd. And he used to start a mediation, and he often would bring an orange into the room, and he put an orange in the middle of the table, and he would say, "Joe, do you want the orange?" And Joe would say, "Yeah, I want the orange." "Tim, do you want the orange?" "Yeah, I want the orange." "Why do you want the orange, Joe?" And Joe would say, "Well, I'm a high-performance athlete. I actually want it because I've been exercising this morning and I just want the juice." "Tim, why do you want the orange?" "Well, I'm a lousy cook, but I do quite like the zest from the skin." And Lawrence would say, "So, Tim and Joe, you can both have what you want."
That's right.
But he also used to then say everyone should walk out of a mediation feeling just a little bit disappointed.
Yes, yeah, indeed.
And but that's 1992, so that's what's that in my maths? 35, 30 plus years.
Yes.
But there we go from in 30 years ago, complete cynicism about even this concept, where
Yes.
now it's a global phenomena in
Yes.
most jurisdictions.
Yes, yes.
Singapore government's really behind it, for example, mandating it there. To now this, I think, continual evolution as to how we actually resolve bigger issues with more people.
Yes.
In a legal sense, people who are outside the contractual relationships. They're not the lender, they're not the employee, but there might be others who are impacted. So it's really just an extension of that. And I suspect if we look, in 10 years' time, we may look back on this podcast and say, that was interesting. They were talking about that. That either fell over.
They got nowhere, those two guys.
Those guys, they're off on a folly. Yeah. Or it was like the Lawrence Street moment where it started to, we started to have a more mature approach to resolution of, in situations where there are parties involved, as I say, which are not necessarily in a contractual relationship.
Well, you heard it here first. Lawrence Street, the Orange and Spedley Securities. Tim, thank you very much for joining us on The Turnaround. We'll keep talking about this.
Many thanks, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.